most brands out there are ever evolving, and year after year they change, and they're kind of an organism where you can put it somewhere, but it could kind of naturally move somewhere else based on the guidelines that you gave.
Welcome to Hidden Characters, Micah.
Thank you, Jack.
For those who don't know, Micah Hoang is a California-based graphic designer who takes a research-intensive approach to design. His research rigor allows him to uncover insights that inform thoughtful design decision-making, which he has applied to the work he's done for clients like Apple, Adobe, Amazon, and others. Micah and I met in LA last year when we were both students. Our mutual friend would bring me to speaker series that would be hosted at Art Center, and we crossed paths there. From that point, we started showing each other the projects that we were working on, and I was really impressed with the research behind the visual identity projects that Micah was working on and how he grounded every design decision in a clear rationale. And so I thought it'd be interesting to have Micah on and talk about his visual identity design process. But I think it would be interesting to start by asking a question to give some context. So, Micah, what is a visual identity and what is its value if done right?
Well, thank you, Jack. First of all, thank you for having me on this podcast. I really appreciate just having this time for us to talk about design and go into the process. And yeah, I think visual identity is a part of a brand. And I think it's really important for us designers to understand what exactly a brand is, because I know when I first started, I thought I knew what it meant, but I realized I didn't really. And so one of my favorite books by Marty Neumeier is called The Brand Gap. And he goes into depth about what a brand is. And the way he describes it, I really like. He says a brand is a gut feeling that a customer has when they interact with a company. It could be a service or a product. And why it's important is because a lot of the times we, as humans, think that we're rational thinkers. We buy something because the facts tell us that this thing has the best benefits for us, or something we read, a study shows that this product is better than another product. But the reality is that we are very emotional beings, and the reason why we might choose one brand over another is because of how we feel from it. So that could be the difference between a $50 t-shirt from a $5 t-shirt that could be made from the same factory. And I think when we understand what a brand is, we can more easily understand what a visual identity is. And I think a visual identity is only one small piece of what a brand is, because a brand is not just the visuals, but it's also the copywriting, maybe the PR, the the website, and the packaging design, or even the spatial design. If it's a store, how are things arranged? These are all things that play into the overall brand. And graphic designers, we get to work really in depth with the visual identity, which I personally find really exciting because it encompasses everything that's visual. So we can think more big picture, think about systems, and think about how all of these little pieces work together.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of recap. And I think it's necessary to, in order to understand visual identity, you have to kind of take that step back and have the bird's eye view on understanding like what a brand is first and foremost. And so I'll lead that into a question asking about what your process is for developing a visual identity. I think it'd be interesting if you could talk to some of that research that I find very like impressive about your work. And then maybe we could get into some of the execution and maybe some of the logistics of how you present that work to clients and what that process looks like.
Yeah, so first of all, a fun fact about me is that I have something called aphantasia, which means that I actually can't visualize things in my head. And I think early on when I first started as a designer, I thought that that was kind of a disability for me because it seems like everyone else could imagine things in their head and be able to sketch things well and execute in a much more creative way, I thought. But I've slowly learned to kind of use that to my advantage. And I think because my mind is blank, I can approach projects with a blank slate and try to start by looking from the client's perspective and going directly into what does the client actually want? What are the client's pain points? What is the history of the brand? Why is the brand standing out from other brands? And going really in depth about the context. Like I think because of aphantasia, I need more context to conjure things up. I can't just come up with something out of my mind. Yeah, like I said, I think it's a strength actually because I start working on projects with a blank slate, I need a specific logical reason or rationale for every little thing that I do. I spend honestly a vast majority of the time researching and digging into the brand strategy. And once I've felt like I've dug deep enough, I'll start, yeah, going to some sketching. I honestly don't sketch a whole lot because that's not one of my strengths. I like to go directly into Illustrator and start brainstorming things. I like to look for typefaces immediately, going on websites like Fonts in Use, and even looking at books from libraries and studying different typefaces and where they're used, and just trying to find ways to tie the the idea of the brand and the history of the brand with something else. So maybe if this company was created in the 70s and they want to have that retro feel and go back to that, I'll go and dig for books from that time period and look at how they design things. What are their grids like? What is their grid system and typeface choice? What colors are they using? And why? And how do we make a modern twist of that? And how do we stand out from the competitors that usually all have a similar look and feel? Yeah, it really depends on who the client is for the specific process. I think if I'm working with a client that's not a designer, then it's really important for me to keep a lot of the behind the scenes process under wraps, to be honest. I don't like to show them anything that isn't polished or final because I don't want them to get the wrong idea or choose a concept that doesn't really make sense. Versus when I'm working with creative directors or skilled designers, then I can trust them and know that they have good input and they have that design background to inform me. So, for example, when I'm working at Apple, everyone around me is a designer and everyone 5 layers up had a design background. So they're literally sitting next to me and working alongside me, and I can show them something. What do you think of this color? What do you think of this typeface? And we can kind of work hand in hand for that. But at the end of the day, when we're presenting, it's always important to know who the person we're presenting to is. So if I'm doing a freelance project, I could be presenting to a non-creative client. So the goal for that is to make everything polished, everything look beautiful, and just show them why this brand works for them. Versus if we're presenting to a stakeholder, like a marketing product manager or something at Apple, we need to think about what background they're coming from and what are they interested in. Are they more interested in the copywriting or are they more interested in this 3D piece that we've done, or are they just more interested in the music choice, something like that. But just leaning into the things that they care about and being able to convince them and persuading them and presenting well is really important for that.
Yeah, I love that. What you described as what you initially thought was like a disability and something that would hold you back. Leaning into that and kind of using that to fuel that logical thinking, where you try to dissect what the client is looking for, whether that's like that example you described of like the retro look. And then because you're not attached to like, or you don't have any kind of preconceived notions in your head that you're thinking about, I think you being able to then like logically draw what they're looking for with like whatever the era is or some of the more kind of visual cues that are traditionally tied to that and use that as your starting place and then work from there, I think is interesting. And then I also think too that idea of going right to Illustrator is less traditional, maybe a hot take for some people. This is the old
Yeah.
heads, you know. But yeah, very interesting. The next question I have for you is whether you're working with designers or not on some of these visual identity processes, eventually they need to be like what the tools that you build and sort of the system that you establish needs to be put to use. And so I'm curious in terms of handing off a visual identity, how do you do it in a way that maximizes the kind of the integrity of what you designed? Do you find that that works well through brand guidelines? And if you're doing something like that, do you try to preemptively, are you thinking about like, okay, what would allow somebody to have the most flexibility? Or are there times where you intentionally try to keep it more restraint because maybe the system is something that can break easier? I'm curious about what's going in your head when you are thinking about the system being used after you design it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And again, it really depends on who we're handing off this guideline to. And it varies a lot based on that. For example, when I was working at Apple, we didn't actually have any overall brand guidelines to follow. It was kind of assumed and built into the design DNA of Apple that the brand will always be evolving every single year, and it's kind of up to the designers to push and pull on what has already been done. How can we push something just a little bit further, but keep it restrained enough to still feel like Apple? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we had to work through during that time, not having a specific guideline. But it's also a strength because the team is hundreds of graphic designers that are all insanely talented. And so they all have the skill set and the ability to push it. And we have so many creative directors and many layers of approval that and people to keep us in check and keep us constrained. Yeah, I think not having a brand guideline, it makes the work much more exciting as an in-house designer. I think oftentimes in-house designers just feel like a production machine, like you're in a cog. Someone gives you brand guidelines and you just have to execute it. They'll give you templates and you just change the text, change the color. But at a place like Apple or some of these other big tech companies, I see OpenAI and Meta is doing some really cool stuff with their brand. And their internal teams really are able to push it a lot because of the openness and the lack of a brand guideline. But another example I could give is that last summer I was at a smaller motion design studio, and there were only two or three designers, and everyone else was a videographer or pure animation person. So I brought up designing a brand guideline for them because they were kind of doing a brand refresh at the time for their 10-year anniversary. And knowing that my primary audience was a non-designer, I had to actually create templates and create tutorials step by step. Okay, when you receive this template, how do you change the text? How do you change the color? And how do we keep the grid exactly the same so that you don't mess it up, you know what I mean? And and for that, it worked really well because even producers, people that normally just use Google Slides or PowerPoint, I was able to teach them how to use Figma and keep that brand consistency overall, even though they lacked that design powerhouse that a place like Apple would have. So I think, yeah, being a designer that's versatile and understands what the needs are at its core is the most important part.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I think that idea of sort of addressing what's contextually appropriate in a given
Right.
situation is always the best way forward. Because in one situation, like giving those templates to somebody who knows how to design is like not much of a value add, but somebody who's maybe unfamiliar with design tools, it can really empower them by having like that template where like the system is almost built in to the template. So by using that tool, like you're automatically following the brand system. I think that's really interesting. I like the idea of all the designers have like a kind of mutual understanding of what the guideline is, whether there's even when there's nothing on paper
Yeah.
about it. And I think that idea of like everybody being on the same page for what it is, even though it's sort of an unwritten thing, but then
Yeah.
being able to check each other when you're like going outside of it, or maybe when you're not pushing yourself enough. I think that formula is like interesting and I could see like producing great results. And like it's no wonder that Apple's one of my favorite brands.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's cool.
Yeah. It's pretty interesting how Apple works because everyone higher up, like creative director and up, a lot of them have been there 10, 20 years, but most of the design team is only a couple years in, much younger designers. So they have that drive to really push it and try new things. And it has to get approved by the veterans that have been there for 20 plus years that really understand the brand. So it has that good balance of push and pull, I think.
Yeah, I think that dichotomy
Yeah.
is like a recipe for success and interesting results.
Yeah.
And it's funny because like as much as that in my head is like the best case scenario and sort of like the context that you want to be designing in, where you have like you want to like when you go into a design process, having like sort of the idea that there's kind of very limited boundaries and then having sort of like those guardrails that are like the CDs who are the veterans. I think that sort of dynamic is like everything you could have asked for. but it's so hard, I feel like, to manufacture that because
Yeah.
in order to like create that, there needs to be so much like history and so many people who have such like a keen understanding of what the brand is. Like I feel like,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like it's something that you can't like just conjure up with a new brand. And so yeah, I think that's super interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something that I'd also want to hear about is this is maybe more of like a contextually dependent question too, but I'm curious because you have such a strong grasp of what a visual identity is and that process of building whatever the client needs. What do you see as like a reasonable timeline for handing something like that off and or like I guess even like developing it and then getting it prepared to hand off? I know it's a very broad question, but kind of curious if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, well, in terms of freelance projects, because I've been pretty locked in at school for the past few years, I haven't had a whole lot of time for those. So those are mostly reserved for the summer and when I have a break from school. I think the important part is knowing what I'm able to do in what amount of time frame and being realistic about those deadlines. Yeah, oftentimes I've done freelance projects where it's a visual identity in a month, but the brand guideline is 2 or 3 pages and there's just a simple 20-page presentation at the end of the day. Sometimes that's all a client needs, if you're working for a startup that doesn't have a lot of budget and they're just trying to get their footing, get started and have something to go off of, a simple logo design, a simple color palette and some guidelines for a website. I don't want to deliver something that they don't need at that moment. And so again, it goes back to understanding the client's needs at the time and also understanding my needs and how much time I need to work on something. And for school projects, we've done visual identities in about 3 months or so. But honestly, it still feels really rushed. Like we dig as deep as we can, but at the end of the day, we're trying to crunch for finals, and some things are sloppy and not perfect. And yeah, I've talked to people that have worked at studios where a visual identity was a 2-year process. It could be even longer. And I think a misconception people have of a visual identity project is that it's always something that just starts and then it finishes. But I think most brands out there are ever evolving and year after year they change and they're kind of an organism where you can put it somewhere, but it could kind of naturally move somewhere else based on the guidelines that you gave. I think in-house designers are kind of underrated because although sure the studio might kick off a rebrand or kick off an identity, the in-house designers are really the ones who have to take that identity and decide how are we going to use it? How are we going to use the guidelines and how do we preserve this brand for 5, 10, 20, 30 years in the future? I think that's its own unique challenge. And building like systems and frameworks and how do we onboard a new designer in our company? How do we hire a freelancer for 2 months, like things like that that people don't always see on award sites or, shout out pages or anything.
Yeah, I honestly couldn't agree more, and I'm so on the
Yeah.
same page about like in-house designers being underrated. And I've never heard it be described as like an organism. But I think that's a great analogy. You're not delivering like the end product. You're delivering like a tool at the end of the day. And that tool, like its features can change and like the way it's used and applied can be ever evolving and iterative. And I think that's more and more what we see today. And so, yeah, I love that. I'm going to quickly interrupt my conversation with Micah to tell you about the sponsor of today's episode, Drawdown Books. Drawdown publishes and sells books about graphic design, typography, illustration, photography, art, and architecture. When it comes to graphic design, they carry everything from the classics like Grid Systems by Joseph Miller Brockman and The Elements of Typographic Style by Robert Bringhurst, all the way to the newest of releases. Books may be the very best way to learn about design and its history. I certainly think so, and I've ordered from Drawdown plenty of times in the past. If you too are interested in learning about design through books, I highly recommend you check out Drawdown's collection on their website at draw-down.com, which is also in the description. And now back to my conversation with Micah. Another question that would be that you already sort of touched on a little bit that I think would be interesting to hear about is during your time at Apple. I feel like Apple has such a attention to detail, universally appreciated, whether people like it's like one of these things where like good design is invisible and there's just sort of like a clarity that comes with that work. And so I'm curious, From working with the team that values function and clarity, I'm curious if you've learned anything about the visual identity process that you didn't appreciate as much prior to working with them.
Yeah, I think Apple in some ways is kind of a bubble. The way it works there is not like anywhere else in the world. People that work there say that. And yeah, so I made sure to talk to as many people as I could during my time there. And I asked every single person, what are the biggest lessons that you learned from your time here? And I actually wrote them down. So I can share directly from
Okay.
there. Yeah, and most of them are very repetitive. People say the same things over and over. So, I mean, number one, nothing great is done alone. The Apple team is so big, and just the identity team is at least 100 people. And this is just working on specific visual identities for products. That's not even talking about other visual identities outside of that, or like Apple Music or Apple TV. Yeah, there's a whole team for video production. There's a whole motion design team, a whole CG team, a whole copywriting team, packaging team. So many teams that I probably have never met or heard of. Just because of that, there's always someone better than you at something. So it's a really great opportunity to learn from others. And I see it in everyone that I worked with and collaborated with there. They all tell me the same thing that, every day they're learning something new. Just finding who the expert is at a specific thing. It could be, oh, I need Cinema 4D help. Talk to this person. Or, oh, I need help with web design. There's someone else to talk to. Oh, someone else specializes in packaging design or, you know, packaging and website combined or some weird combination like that. Because everything is so collaborative and we have so many people, it's it's always tough to kind of balance between, oh, I want to own something and I want to say that I did this versus someone else is better. Let me just give it to them. And oftentimes, almost every time, there's someone better than you at something. So, so it's just a matter of figuring out what you're good at, what you can lean in on, and then what you should just give to someone else to do that has more experience and kind of knows what they're doing. Another thing is to just stay curious. Everyone there is always, like I said, trying to learn new softwares and learning from each other and exploring new ways of doing things. And yeah, it's kind of like a hub of talent over there. People have so much experience from different studios. Some people are freelancers, some people are entrepreneurs. They've done their own thing. So yeah, there's always something to learn from someone. And another big thing is patience because it's such a large organization with so many levels of hierarchy. I think I had like 5 levels of managers above me or something. So pretty much every little design detail had to get approved by 5 levels. So you can imagine how long everything took there. For example, a poster design took 3 months to do. During my 5 months there, we still didn't decide on a tagline. And I think if I were to guess, we're still trying to decide what the tagline is for this thing that I was working on. Just like spending months on something and having it all thrown away, you have to get used to it and have very little ego because, yeah, like 99% of the work that's created never sees the light of day because some layer of approval said that it wasn't good. Just being persistent and playing the long game. I think those are really important things working at Apple.
Yeah, I think that idea of you having to be selfless and sort of recognizing for the greater good of the project that maybe somebody else who has a certain skill set should get involved, swallowing your pride and yeah, just being in pursuit of what's best for like the overall product. And then also being recognizing that not everything you do is gonna see the light of day and that that's not like a something to take personally and just sort of rolling with the punches and taking everything in stride and staying curious, I think is, yeah, I'm not surprised that's advice that you see between many people.
Yeah, and I don't think it's like necessarily the best place for every designer. Some designers they want to have that excitement of working on new projects all the time, getting awards and recognition all the time, or being able to really own something for themselves. And I don't blame them. I think being a creative, all of us kind of desire to be recognized, and we all desire to feel like we're really contributing a lot. Yeah, working at a place like Apple, you have to be okay with just being kind of a cog in a machine in a way. But it is also super fun getting to work with a huge team and when it's done, being able to say that, I helped with this. And it's just the scale of it is amazing.
Once you get over that hill of doing something so big and recognizing that it's not a single person's contribution that leads to something like that, I think
Yeah.
is builds a certain bond. And I like what you said about how that's not for everybody. Some people want to sort of see the impact of their work on a more
Yep.
kind of short-term basis and sort of get feedback in that way. But I guess a question that I'm interested in is I know you said that there's so many different kind of skill sets and there's people sort of at the top of their craft in different sort of departments, whether that's like motion design, CG, packaging. I'm curious, you always hear people talk about like the jack of all trades versus a specialist. Would you say that somebody like who's a jack of all trades could work well in a place like that, or is it more like a specialist driven sort of like design environment, would you say?
I think it depends where you work. Yeah, it depends where you're working. At a place like Apple, it's so big that there's room for all types of people. So I was in the identity team. So we were overseeing how everything worked together. So we were the first design team to interact with the engineers and the marketing people to then hand it off to the specialized team. So we're kind of like the bridge between those. And so most people in our team, they were more of that jack of all trades type of person. They knew a bit of motion design, they knew 2D, 3D, some maybe some UI, UX, some packaging. We just needed to bring it to a fidelity that the specialist team would understand later on. So we're just showing the big picture and proof of concept, getting everything approved by the higher ups before we send it off to production. But there were also some really talented specialists that were just insane at like Houdini or After Effects or people that specialized in lighting. And there was a lot of room for that too. So it just comes down to what type of person you are. And if you enjoy getting really deep into one thing, or if you want to always be trying new things and being that jack of all trades type of person. But I also think that with a lot of the new technology and AI, jack of all trades designers are starting to have more and more advantage. And because of these tools just becoming so much more powerful every single day, part of me feels like investing too much time into mastering a software isn't worth it anymore because a month later something else will come out that can generate the same thing you spent a week on in a minute or something like that. And so, yeah, being a jack of all trades and having design tastes and being able to think conceptually, those things will take you a long way, even despite, AI making execution and certain softwares much easier.
Yeah, and you anticipated a question that I was going to ask about AI. I'm curious. I like how you described how it sort of uplifts every skill set within like a portfolio of different tools that you may be like learning as a jack of all trades person. I'm curious, like maybe across the board when it comes to visual identities, do you see it impacting the way that they're designed and maybe sort of what the deliverables might look like? Just keeping in mind some of the things you said before too about like the idea of passing on identities has sometimes been like to in-house teams can sometimes feel like you're then passing it on to somebody who's then just sort of like the production person. Do you see like AI having the ability to like empower like in the same way that we were talking identity and like a system that you deliver it being like a tool? Do you see any ways where that system as a tool becomes more powerful through AI or some of these emerging technologies that sort of like would allow somebody to do more with what you hand off? And I know that's like an abstract question, but it's just sort of like something that's been in my mind. It's like how what
Yeah.
would be the impact long term of new emerging tools? Yeah, like empower the people that are receiving your systems.
Yeah, definitely. I would say for myself, I've already kind of embraced AI as part of my identity design process. AI is already my copywriter, my competitive analysis, my photographer, my storyboard artist, my project manager, and the list goes on. Yeah, I think it's still better to have a person, a specialist, to do all of those things. But sometimes when there's a budget constraint or there's a timeline constraint, and if it's just me working on something on my own, the AI allows me to. just stretch that much further in terms of my impact that I can help with. Yeah, I think the important part to know is that AI will make the how of everything much easier. Like, how do I make something? I can just ask ChatGPT and it'll tell me exactly step by step what to do. If I have a question about software, I can just ask ChatGPT and it'll tell me. Maybe it'll suggest another software for me to do. But what I don't think will go away is being able to dig into what are we making and why. And those things still require that level of research that comes with that design process. I think honestly, designers should always prioritize that the most. And the execution is important, but yeah, execution will just get replaced. I mean, right now, a lot of, typography and traditional graphic design hasn't been replaced yet. It's not like illustration or photography that the AI can do a good job with. I wouldn't be surprised if all of that could also just get taken over. And so, it's kind of a black box and no one really knows exactly where it'll go. So what I'm trying to do is to just stay up to date, stay curious about all of these new things, and constantly be asking myself, what can I contribute that the AI cannot contribute? And sometimes that line gets more and more blurry every day. Yeah, we just have to wait and see.
Another thing I want to ask on like the AI topic is I liked what we were talking about before when it came to like how you described like the Apple system where there's sort of this understood brand system and then the designers on the team who like come in like sort of the younger designers, lots of energy, lots of ideas are creating things and then getting like they get vetted by the people who have the greatest understanding of the system. I guess they like reel in the ideas that maybe are sometimes like really like
Yeah,
out there, you know,
yeah,
to make it feel like familiar as like an Apple kind of visual. I'm curious,
yeah,
do you ever see like the AI playing that role? Let's say I'm an in-house designer where there's a brand system like that the AI has an understanding of, and then I have a loose understanding of that system and I'm making things, and then the AI kind of feeds back to me to tell me whether I'm like close enough and that whether it thinks that that will be recognized as like the system. Again, another
yeah.
abstract question, but just kind of throwing them out there, kind of want to pick your brain.
Yeah, I think so. That's a really good use case for AI because you know what AI is, it's just spitting out what you put into it. So hypothetically, a company could throw in all of their brand assets, their history, all of their history of work, just throw it into the system. Theoretically, this system would be able to tell any designer, give advice based on everything you've thrown it and kind of reel things in or suggest new ideas or even throw out copywriting lines like, oh, based on our current brand voice, how would we say this message? Maybe you could throw it in the system and it would, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if most companies that can afford it would invest into their own AI systems that would create a lot of those tools to make it easier. Because yeah, a lot of in-house designers waste a lot of time going back and forth and trying to figure out if something is on brand or not. And oftentimes people don't really know the answer.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And yeah, well, it's kind of like what you said, only time will tell. And like the best kind of way forward is just to kind of stay on top of it and always be assessing like what kind of, I feel like AI in a lot of ways like makes you step back and ask the kind of heavy hitting questions of like, what is the actual kind of like core competency of the role of a graphic designer? And in
Yeah.
a lot of ways, like it isn't the how switching gears from like the AI robots to a more human topic. In your bio, you say when you're not designing, you're somewhere on the trails, and that's the same place I am when I'm not designing. And
Nice.
I want to talk about like health when it comes to like screen intensive roles like graphic design. Because I feel like there are some stereotypes that I don't love to hear. And like as much as there is some truth to like it being such like a screen demanding job, but that idea of you have to sort of submit yourself to that routine of like being hunched over your computer and like just guzzling coffee and like not taking care of yourself. I feel like is something that like I don't know I want to kind of try to personally like break those stereotypes and find strategies to maintain kind of mental and physical health while working such a screen intensive role. And so I thought you'd be a good person to ask if you have any strategies for mental health and physical health as a graphic designer. And obviously nobody's perfect, but I'm just curious if you have any, if anything's worked really well for you that you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, well, I think it's first of all, it's great that you're trying to break that stereotype. I think I'm trying to do the same thing out here, being that designer that takes care of themselves.
Yeah.
And it's honestly pretty difficult depending on the season. And life's all about balance. And sometimes we need to get into a season where we just hunch over and lock in for a few months and don't leave the house because we have something to do or we have something great that we're working on. And I think that's totally fine. But, once that season's over, I make it an effort to get outside and get onto the trails, go running, go lift some weights, go see friends, talk to people. Oftentimes, when I'm running with someone new, talking to a non-designer, it helps me to get out of my bubble. And it always reminds me that as designers, we're designing for non-designers, not other designers. So, we need time with people that are not like ourselves. I feel like oftentimes we put ourselves in a bubble where, especially if we go to art school or we work at a design studio, basically we only spend our life with other people that think the same way as us, other creative people that are also, hunched over, guzzling coffee, things like that. But yeah, I think a healthy body is a healthy mind, and a healthy mind makes great work. So that's pretty much all I can say about that.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I feel
Yeah,
like that is something that isn't spoken about enough. That idea that you're designing for non-designers. And even just like kind of on that same topic of AI making you step back and ask big questions about like what even is the discipline? What is the value that I'm providing? And in a lot of ways, it's like visual communication. And then you kind of peel back that another level. It's like communication in general requires like a connection and like an understanding of who you're speaking to by like being out there in the world and actually interacting with more people helps you get an understanding of how to communicate with them better. And
right.
then you can translate that into like visual communication.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I like that there's another designer who's reaching for the stars when it comes to maintaining health and wellness when even working in such like a demanding screen intensive job.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's so good to just get out there, get off the screen, and push myself physically as a break from pushing myself mentally.
Yeah, yeah, I love
Yeah,
that. I was in one of the earlier interviews when I had Devin on.
yeah,
He was saying something that I deeply resonated with when he was like, man, like I love graphic design, but like sometimes I am so like happy to get off the computer, and it's
yeah,
such a grueling process at times, like just being so locked into your computer. And yeah, I just related with that so much.
yeah, yeah, me too.
But well, Micah, those were all the questions I had for you. I always conclude the show by asking a question that's in the spirit of why the show started, to give recognition to graphic designers doing impressive work. So I want to ask you, is there anybody that you really look up to and has been doing great work and you'd love to see featured on the show?
Yeah, well, I think one of the people I would think of off the top of my head is our mutual friend, Alan. And he's an incredible motion designer. He's really great at 2D, 3D, and thinking about it in terms of a brand identity as well. And he was really encouraging to me because he was one of the people that pushed me to take more initiative as a student, take on leadership roles and to lead events and just to, if I have an idea, just to put it out there and go for it. And he's also just a great designer, very talented, and makes inspiring work all the time and still a student, which is crazy. Yeah, another person, Carlo Francisco, he was my coworker and also an art center alum. And I looked up to him a lot because he sat right next to me, so he was always chatting with me and shared a lot of his insights. And I just love not only how talented he is, but also his humility and his learner mindset. Like he's always trying to learn a new software and always hitting up different people to learn from them. And so yeah, I think he's an art director now, so he'd be a great person to talk to.
Yeah, I mean, if you two are listening, I'd love to have you on. And we have director on. I'm actually that's like an episode that I'm trying to kind of seed right now,
Nice.
sort of that perspective of going from if because a lot of people want to take it from like graphic designer to art director. So I'd love to have somebody on who's sort of done that progression. So,
Yeah,
how do
for
you say
sure.
his name? It's Carlo.
Carlo Francisco. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Carlo, if you're listening, love to have you on. And well, with that, Micah, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts. It was really a pleasure.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Jack.
Okay, see ya. Hey, just checking in to say thank you for sticking to the end. This was big episode number 5, and it was great to have Micah on for the 5th episode milestone. He's such a thoughtful designer, so it was great to unpack his research and visual identity design process. If you liked the episode, definitely engage with it, like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and it will help me attract more interesting guests. And I just recorded some very exciting ones, so stay tuned for those. And I will see you then. Signing off. Take care.